I lived in a house from hell for a couple of weeks. I was a college student and my parents were paying for a house for me to live in. Yes, I know I was spoiled. However, the house was decently modest, nothing fancy or huge, and I was happy with it. Well, for the first few days, I suppose. Anyway, things quickly started getting strange. On a rainy Saturday afternoon with nothing to do, I was watching TV for a few hours. That was when I heard a scrape on my living room floor. I looked from the room, thinking an animal got into the house or something. I sat back down and resumed watching TV. That was the first weird occurrence. Didn't think too much of it. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night, which made for an excuse to not go out. I stayed in watching more TV in the living room. I perked up when I thought I heard something from the kitchen laughably. I took a pillow with me as if that was going to be some sort of weapon. I walked over to the kitchen doorway, and there in the middle of the dark kitchen was a box of Cheerios on the floor, spilled out hundreds of tiny little O's. I had no idea how that could have happened. Nevertheless, I dropped the pillow and began cleaning up the Cheerios off the floor. As I was doing so, I heard a creak like the sound of weak areas from a wood floor making when someone steps on them. It was by the kitchen table. I looked up, but nobody was there. I knew I was going crazy. Now, every little sound must have been making me more and more paranoid. I cleaned the Cheerios and went back to watching TV. The thunder outside was getting louder. As the worst of the storm seemed to be passing, I found it to be strangely relaxing. That was the last thing I remember appreciating the sound of the storm outside before waking up from what seemed to be an hour-long doze. The TV was still on, but that wasn't what woke me. I remember believing I woke up to a bang or thud from downstairs regardless. I turned off the TV and marched upstairs to bed. The next day was normal as it was the day after that. It wasn't until the next gray rainy day that strange things started happening again. I woke up in my bed that morning feeling like I had been drinking all night. The night before, I felt sicker than I've ever felt before. With any hangover, I didn't do much that day. The gloomy dark weather only made me more bedridden. I left the TV in my bedroom on all day, just as background noise and with a trash bag by my side, in case I had to puke. I muted the TV after hearing sounds coming from above me. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic was built over that bedroom. It wasn't just one thud that I heard, it was 3 or 4. I managed to get out of bed despite the fact that every time I moved, I wanted to puke. I pulled the string to the attic door down, took one of my old baseball bats with me and climbed up the steps. I pulled the light switch down to light up the attic. There were a few old boxes that must have belonged to the previous owners scattered about, but I couldn't see any living things to produce those noises. I climbed back down quickly because I was kind of scared of that attic. There were no more noises until that night. When I woke up, I thought that it was the thunder that woke me up, but certainly not. It was the same familiar thud sounds that were coming from the attic. It gave me the most chills I've ever had in my life. I pulled the strings of the attic door back down, took my baseball bat once again and climbed up the stairs. I made myself angry and screamed in the most intimidating voice I could. But before I could turn the light on, I heard the sound of a child giggling in the pitch black attic. Words cannot describe the feeling of weightlessness, the feeling of my insides dropping out of my body. The word fear is not even enough to describe what I felt at that moment. I was out of the house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. I explained everything the best I could. My parents saw how emotional I was about this, and in a weird sense, I think they believed me. I packed all of my things up with my parents the next day and moved back home to this day. I'm convinced that what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal, and I don't want to know what would have happened if I kept staying there. I live in a suburban part of Ohio with my wife, Jess. One night I was coming home from work at the usual time, which was 6 o'clock to be exact. When I got home, I immediately noticed something was off that day. I couldn't exactly pinpoint it, but I just had that feeling. I opened the front door and found muddy footsteps around the whole entrance hall, but weirdly enough, the muddy footsteps stopped at the entrance hall. Only that part of the house. And then I moved over to the kitchen and found the fridge door opened. I called out to my wife, Jess, but obviously she wasn't home. She did text me earlier that she was out with her friends and that she wouldn't be back until later that night. I also don't have any kids, which means someone broke in and did all of this. I looked around the house some more, but I didn't find anything out of place. Or maybe I didn't notice, who knows. I thought maybe Jess called someone to fix something in the house, which could explain the muddy footsteps and maybe the open fridge door. But honestly, I wasn't sure, so I called Jess and asked her if she maybe went outside and came back in the house without realizing her shoes were dirty. She admitted that that might have happened in the morning. She did go outside to water the plants, but that she doesn't remember the complete story. I figured it was Jess and just went to the living room and watched some TV. And after Jess came home, nothing else happened. We had dinner and went to sleep. That night, I woke up around 1 a.m. Just for reference. I'm a light sleeper, so this happens quite often. However, that night, I don't think I woke up because of that. Instead, I kept hearing these faint creaking sounds coming from the floorboards. Somewhere in the house, I immediately but quietly got up and gently walked over to the stairs. I tried my best not to make a sound. As I slowly made my way downstairs, I realized that the sound had completely stopped. So then I quietly made my way back upstairs as the sound probably came from one of the rooms upstairs, given that I basically looked around the entire ground floor. As I moved up to the stairs, I noticed the attic trapdoor slightly left open again. It was one of those things that I couldn't be 100% certain about. I never really looked at the attic door that much, so maybe it could have been left open since yesterday morning or, today in the afternoon. Ever since we moved in the house, at that moment, I felt like I was going crazy. I made my way back to the bedroom when right as I entered, I found an old skinny man standing on the opposite side of the bed upon me entering. He was completely unresponsive, just staring down at my sleeping wife. I screamed so loud that my wife jumped up and almost hit him in the face. She rushed out of the bed and we both went to the backyard to call the cops. The cops came and found him in the same numb state that we found him in. I got a better look at him, and to me, he almost looked completely brain dead. The cops suspected that he was probably on some sort of heavy drugs. We thanked them and they took him away. I knew I wasn't crazy. My wife said he was probably hiding in our bathroom, which makes me even more unsettled given that he would have already entered our bedroom beforehand. I don't wish this to happen to anybody. Just the mere thought of a stranger in your home stalking you just gives me the creeps. When me and my troublemaking friends were 13 years old, one of the many rowdy and mischievous things we would do on Saturday night would be ding-dong ditch sessions. 10 years ago, we all lived on the same block in a typical suburban neighborhood. At the time, there were a lot less houses and more woods though. So for the sake of things, I'm going to make up names for my friends. For this case, I'm going to say there was Mark, James, and Matt. And either Mark or James were usually the ones to go up the houses and ring the bells. Matt and I, on the other hand, would usually find hiding spots right away. We would hit about 5 or 6 houses. I remember all of the men who answered the doors gave pretty much the same reactions. They'd step out of the house and yell a thing or two. And then they would walk inside for a couple of hours. We'd ring the bell again for a better reaction. One guy yelled he was calling the cops the second time. So when he shut his door, we all booked it down the street and went back to the block over. As mentioned, 10 years ago in this neighborhood, there were patches of woods sitting where houses sit today. On the next block over, there were a few patches of wood surrounding some of the houses, and the houses on this block seemed to be more on camps. The first house on the block was across the street from the patch of woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. The house was kind of run down, looking tall grass, a ratty old car with a cover on it in the driveway, and overall just a small house. Mark went up to ring the bell. He barely had time to make it across the street before the door opened. It was another man to answer the door. This guy really big, about 6 foot and stocky build. Unlike the others, he was furious immediately. He walked around his whole front yard, checking the bushes, yelling threats. We all laughed as we always did. Eventually, he finally went back inside. Mark waited a few minutes, checked the windows, and then ran back up to the stoop to ring the bell. Again, I didn't really envy him with this house. I would not be bold enough to ring that man's bell again. Mark knew he probably didn't have as much time, so this time he ran to the side of the house and out of sight. When the door opened, it was much quicker than last time, and this time around the man came out with a rifle in his hand. We all looked at each other simultaneously, going, "Oh." Under our breath, the man checked all the places he checked before, and then a few extra places this time, unlike the last time. He checked behind his car, behind a couple of trees, and then he walked to the center of his lawn and just stood there as if he was thinking profoundly. He just stood there and then looked around and managed to stop his head at where we were, facing towards him at the woods. Me, Matt, and James looked at each other. We all ducked even lower in hopes that he didn't see us. After 10 seconds of staring in our direction, the man went back into his home. Then we saw him appear at his front window, standing still like a statue. Looking in our direction in the woods, once again, we saw Mark creeping back over to the man's front door, but there was nothing we could do. We were too afraid to move or yell anything. Mark rang the bell once again and ran for it. The man didn't move though. At least not for this time, and not another minute. He then turned and walked away from the window. We didn't see Mark again, but we were still too nervous to move or say anything. The next thing I remember, we heard Mark's voice from across the street yelling, "Run." We didn't understand until we heard someone running up from behind us. Realizing upon turning our heads that it was the man from across the street with his rifle in hand, pointed at us. We ran like little boys, like prey from a predator. To Mark, who was waiting for us across the street, we ran for blocks until we were sure we lost him. Mark explained that he yelled when he saw the man sneaking across the street into the patch of woods with his gun. We didn't report him or anything. All we did was tell a few friends, and that was it. Luckily, the house was many blocks from us, so we never really had to pass it again. But till this day, I've wondered what would that man have done if we didn't escape from him.